I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. With us and back by popular demand, a guest I had on just a few weeks ago, and I thought, why not? They have these losers on CNBC and MSNBC and Fox and other all the time that they don't have anything to say. Why not have a really good guest on when people are asking for her to come back on? And I was very happy to book Catherine Austin Fitts again because you're all over the world. You were just out on the West Coast. Catherine Austin Fitts, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
Greg, I'm back in the heartland and happy to be here, and it's great to be on with you.
And let me extend your introduction. Of course, you now do the Solari report at Solari.com. You are an investment advisor. You are a journalist. You were a former assistant housing secretary in the Bush 41 administration. You were an investment banker. You handled hundreds of billions of dollars of assets for the government, billions of dollars for other people. You invest all over the world. You are connected. You are bright. And we are very happy to book you back on in this short of a turnaround because I just want to get to the election. You were out on the West Coast, and I know you drove back across the country. Have you ever seen anything like this election with Clinton, who is arguably a criminal with private servers to hide the fact she was accepting treasonous bribes to her global charity fraud, the Clinton Foundation, against Donald Trump, who's not really a great smooth candidate, but anyway, he's a lot of people are taking their hopes on him. Have you ever seen anything other than this election, this presidential election, with Donald Trump and Clinton?
I've never seen anything like it. And I predicted that the election this year would not be very productive because I never thought we'd get into the real issues. And here we are, Greg. I've never seen an election that has triggered a conversation in America that has inspired more discussion of the real issues. Now, part of it is that the sort of education we're all getting about how the Clinton machinery has worked and the establishment machinery has worked for the last 30 years is really very gratifying to watch because we need to hear this. We need to hear how corrupt the system is if we're gonna I used to have a pastor say, if we can face it, God can fix it. We can't fix anything unless we really understand the depth of this thing. So that education has proceeded, and I hope it continues because there's a lot more that has to come out. But the other thing is, one of the things that has happened as the establishment has rejected Donald Trump, he's been freer and freer to talk about what I would call the real deal. And it has now become socially acceptable in America, even fashionable, to talk about things that until now were, I would talk about them, you would talk them on our shows, but most Americans weren't comfortable, didn't feel safe talking about them. And now we're really talking about the real issues, including the fact that there is serious disagreement on the models by which the planet and America and the G7 nations will be governed. There's disagreement between the BRICS and the G7. There's disagreement between Europe and the United States. In the United States, there's disagreements, profound disagreements between the general population and the leadership. The reality is, if you look at what's coming down through the leadership, and this is what the Clintons are fronting for, you're talking about, is the model going to be human or inhuman? The leadership is fronting for something which is wildly inhuman, seriously inhuman, but it hasn't been fashionable to talk about it. And one of Hillary Clinton's strategies has been to put a fluffy female face in front of something which is patently inhuman. And of course, if you look at what's being dished out on the Clinton Foundation, the Clintons, that's how they've made their money, in highly inhuman ways, I would say even genocidal. And so that is all coming out, and it means we're going to have an honest conversation, and that is what this country needs more than anything.
And when you're talking about, genocidal, I mean, we're talking about all the death in Haiti and how they collected money for them and didn't help them. Libya started a big war there. We saw Gaddafi died. She laughs. Syria, which is a huge mess, started on her tenure. I mean, it's terrible. I mean, it's awful. They just want to start wars. Go ahead.
Right, the American model, and you've heard me tell my red button story many, many times, and I've told it on USA Watchdog many times, but the red button story is basically about an American model globally that makes money from force and is run by force. And it's an ugly, once you get in the kitchen on that model, it gets pretty ugly. Now, the interesting thing about the last 20 or 30 years is that's accelerated against Americans. So, for example, if you look at the private prison push, which the Clintons led in the 90s, that is basically doing a very similar thing to Americans as what was done to the Haitians in Haiti. So we're talking about a model that's very inhuman and it's very mean and it's coming. I don't know if you realize this in the third quarter. We do in every wrap up quarterly news, trends, and stories. And one of our top stories for the third quarter was NBC coming out with a little 2 or 3 minute clip saying you ought to microchip your children. And then Dr. Oz came out in support and discussion of microchips. Well, Greg, that means we're livestock. I mean, this is insane. So I think it's funny. Michael Moore did an interview where he said Donald Trump was a Molotov cocktail that we could all throw in the system. And interestingly enough, if you look at the federal system, it has a negative return on investment to taxpayers. And if you believe you can never fix that, then throwing a Molotov cocktail into the middle of it is the most intelligent thing you can do for productivity. And it was when I finally realized that, I wrote the theme on productivity in the second quarter wrap up. I realized, okay, I may be from New York and I may have profound disagreements with Trump style, but I can throw the Molotov cocktail. And so after the second debate, I was going to vote for Gary Johnson. And as you know, I voted for Kasich in the primary. But on the second debate, Greg, when Donald Trump said, I will appoint a special prosecutor, I stood up and cheered and said, for the first time, we're talking about real accountability in America. And then when he said, if I was the president, you'd be in jail, I said, that's it. I'm giving money to Donald Trump, because that is the first time I have ever seen someone of national prominence on the corporate media hold the leadership accountable for their actions. I have been waiting 20 years for one moment of accountability. That was the first in my lifetime. And I said, okay, I'm sending Donald Trump money.
Well, just a quick thumbnail, and you don't have to comment on this, but people tried to kill you, they tried to jail you, they tried to bankrupt you for trying to stick up and say, hey, what's going on in the housing in America? What's going on with this fraud? You stuck up for fraud, and they almost stuck you in the ground. Just so people know that you had a very tough road to hoe with the sinister people.
The Clintons are very dangerous people, and they're allies. So I would say the Clintons and the Bushes are very dangerous people. So this is a dangerous game. And I know when the media decides to frame you falsely, I call it the shriekometer. And you've watched the shriekometer turned on Donald Trump and Mike Pence in a way I've never seen the shriekometer stronger. I call it Monica Lewinsky too this time around. And you saw with the Billy Bush video, you saw Donald Trump, really the shriekometer go after him. And it's interesting, the way he stood up to it was phenomenal. And that's what you need in a president. You need somebody who will stand up to the shriekometer. The last time I've seen somebody effectively stand up to the shriekometer, it was Eisenhower over Sputnik. There's even a documentary on the topic. The shriekometer is very, very powerful, and it's very, very dangerous. Another great example, I don't know if you've seen the Dixie Chicks documentary, Shut Up and Sing, but it shows you an example of what happens when the shriekometer turns on somebody. So we've seen the shriekometer turn on Donald Trump in an amazing way, and his ability to stand up has been admirable.
I want to move on. One of the other things that Donald Trump has brought up, which the mainstream press won't touch. They won't even ask him a question about it, and he said this multiple times. We're going to have a financial meltdown. We're going to have a crash. The system's not very well. Blame the Fed for blowing. Blame the Fed for a bad job. And one of the things that you said, which caught everybody's attention, because for years, multiple interviews, you said we're going to have a slow burn, slow burn, slow burn. You were right. You were right. You nailed it right on the top of the head, poing every time. And now you came out and said, well, the chances for a slow burn have greatly diminished. Where are you on this? Can you explain that further? Because a lot of people who took that point and said, oh, even Catherine Austin Fitts is saying the chances for a slow burn have dramatically diminished. What say you about this slow burn? So you can give a little slow burn diminished 2.0.
So the system has the capacity with monetary policy, in one sense, to keep going forever if the force and military capacity is there to do it. But at some point, Greg, you burn through the fat, you burn through the muscle, and then you have to change institutions. So, for example, we have conducted the federal budget outside of the law related to constitution and financial management. for so long, it's going to be extremely difficult to get people to continue to pay their taxes when they're highly confident the money's not being spent legally and is going to the advantage of small parties or things that they don't understand. And so you can't move further without institutional overhaul. And the thing that frightens me the most is we now see a real push through ALEC in the states to get a balanced budget amendment and a constitutional convention. Now, here's the reality. We are outside and have been outside certainly since 1995, the laws related to financial management under the Constitution. So we haven't enforced the Constitution for 20 years. If we're not going to enforce it, we don't need to change it. So if you're trying to change it, it's not because you're trying to enforce it. Enforcement means you say, okay, where's the now $20 trillion that's missing from the federal government? How do we get it back? If you want to enforce the Constitution or fix things, that's what you do. The reason you get a constitutional convention is you want to tear it up because you're worried now that people realize the extent of the corruption that they're going to try and enforce. And enforce means I put my taxes in an escrow, organized with my neighbors under the county, the state, whatever, to put the money in escrow, as opposed to I pay my taxes. That's the big issue in 2017. How is the federal government going to get people to pay their taxes if the government is not viewed as legitimate?
Do you still think that we could have this meltdown, this slow burn turns into a cliff dive?
Yes, and here's the reason. What we needed to do, you have a win-lose relationship between basically the health of places and the equity markets. And a lot of my work is about how you turn that around and create a win-win relationship. What I talked about in the second quarter report on productivity is we have a win-lose relationship between human productivity and labor productivity. Now, if we want to get more labor productivity, if we want to get a stronger stock market, we need to change those models to win-win. The problem is you've got folks like the Clinton who only know how to play in the win-lose model. They only know how to slap out government money, and they're deeply corrupt, and they're very vested in the current model. They don't want to change. They think if you change the model, you're going to have to change to different kinds of people, which is true because you're going to need, engineers instead of lawyers. So they're not willing to change. They're not willing to bring more transparency to the system. They are basically addicted to privilege. And the question is, how do we change the leadership? It now appears that the leadership is not willing to change without a crisis. And so if everybody's stuck on behaving in unproductive ways, then you're going to have a crisis until they're willing to change.
That crisis could be triggered by the election, the landslide election of Donald Trump, right? I mean, do you think he has a better than even chance of being elected? I don't believe any of the polls. I don't believe any of the polls. I think he's way ahead if you look at social media, if you look at all the other metrics, if you look at his crowd sizes. I think he's winning hands down, and I think the Clintons and the establishment all too well know that. That's why, thus the quote unquote shriekometer.
Well, that's absolutely possible, Greg. I mean, it's absolutely possible that what you're saying is true. Although I do think in the places that are basically floating on a sea of money, where people have not explored what the real facts are, that the Clintons are the people viewed by people floating on a sea of government money to keep the game going, so that when the government cuts have to come, they'll cut the productive instead of the people on the take. So I think there is support there. The reality is, as you said, or as I said, a lot of this is going to come down to how the voting machinery is operated and rigged. Now, at some point, if Clinton's support is really 10% or lower, it's going to be very hard to rig it. If you look at the turnouts at the Trump rallies or the views online, it's hard to imagine he doesn't win in the popular vote in a landslide. But again, this comes down to the machinery, and the machinery is controlled very much by the people who are indicating strong support for Clinton. So I think it's very fluid. I don't know what's going to happen.
Do you think that that they could force, if he does win, do you think they could force this whole thing into the toilet and not let him take office? Financially, let him force, or war? Do you think that could happen?
I don't think so. I don't think so. There's all sorts of rumors and scuttlebutt about how Obama will, maintain a third term or all this kind of stuff. I just don't see that. I don't see that happening.
I think Obama wants
Um,
to leave office. I really think he wants to leave office. I mean, he's out playing golf. He could care less. He said, I think he's telling the New World Order, listen, I did my deal. I want to go to Hawaii and go play golf and get big speaking fees and build my library. I think that's what he wants to do.
right. I don't think he wants to stay. So no, I think Trump will stay, will take office, and a real effort will be made by the establishment to populate a Trump candidacy with people who understand the machinery and understand the issues. I mean, you have an overly complex bureaucracy, an overly complex system, and what you need to manage it, as opposed to blow it up, is people who understand how the system works, understand and can deal with the complexity. And so, if you look at Mike Pence or some of the people Trump's gotten around him, they understand the system. So now, if you look at early indications from who Trump may appoint, they can be equally scary as the Clintons. So, here's the problem: Trump is a wild card. Now, he's done a great job of bringing transparency to a lot of issues, but anybody who's going to point Giuliani at Department of Homeland Security makes me very nervous. So, we don't know what's going to happen, but a real effort will be made by the establishment to get people around him who at least understand the infrastructure. Now, please remember, the President of the United States does not run the federal government. The federal government is run by a whole group of banks and defense contractors who have remarkable control. So when I was Assistant Secretary of Housing, I would demand data from the defense contractor that ran the information and payment systems at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They would refuse to give it to me, and I would have months and months of wars trying to get the data. So the idea that the president can just push a button and things are going to happen isn't how things work.
Well, at least it's better than the alternative, which would be, Clinton and the Supreme Court would turn so ugly and to be terrible. I mean, just on that alone, if Trump gets in, the Supreme Court and the federal judges would be probably worth the price of admission. What say you?
So here's the thing: that one of the things that touched me very, very deeply in the last 2 weeks, I want to tell you about, because it was quite a remarkable drive from California. I stopped in many places, talked to many people, but I was coming out of Boulder and headed towards Tulsa through Kansas, and I stopped at a Flying J truck stop. I spend a lot of time driving in America, Greg, and I always stop at the truck stops. That's where I get my gas. That's where I go to the ladies' room. And I love truckers. I have a thing with truckers. A lot of the truckers are people who couldn't make it in farming, or the small business went down and they wanted to stay independent, so they became truckers. And the truckers have a lot of knowledge about how the economy works. They're very intelligent. They're very independent minded. A lot of them listen to your show, Coast to Coast. They're a remarkable group of people, and they're sort of, I think, is a group of freedom fighters in America, and just very good people. They watch out for you on the road, et cetera. Anyway, so they're a group of people I think deserve our consideration, because they are highly productive as opposed to, a lot of the people in Washington and Wall Street. Anyway, so they contribute to the real economy. I walk into the bathroom. In the truck stops, they have big bathroom complexes. I walk into the bathroom complex at Flying J truck stop, and on the left is the ladies' room, and on the right, what used to be the men's room is co-ed. There's a sign for men's room, and then a bar, and then women's room. And so you have two choices. You can go in the co-ed bathroom, or you can go in the women's bathroom, which meant the truckers don't have, the male truckers, which is the vast majority of the truckers, do not have their own bathroom. They have to share it with women. And I'm sure it was done to deal with the transgender situation. And I looked at it, Greg, and I almost started to cry, because I said, this is the greatest FU you could ever do to this wonderful group of people. And I thought, no wonder productivity is not growing. How can you be productive when people are giving you that kind of FU? And I thought, this country has gone certifiably insane. If you look at all the problems we have the U.S. Navy promising every sailor will go through transgender training before the end of 2017. And we're now doing this to the truckers. I mean, this country has gone certifiably insane. Reminds me of my favorite tweet of the third quarter that I told you about when somebody tweeted out the decision by the NIH to permit the mixture of human DNA with animal DNA. And he wrote on the tweet, will someone just please nuke us now? So we're talking, I get back to the inhuman thing. We're talking about inhuman, insane behavior. And this has got to stop because if you look at the inhumanity rolling down on the average family, whether it's heavy schedules of vaccines that cause autism or GMO food that make people sick or spraying over our head that are putting nanoparticles in our brain and causing us to be toxic with heavy metals, which produces all sorts of diseases, which produces high healthcare costs. I could go on and on and on and on. Basically, what you're talking about is destroying the humanity and the productivity of the general population. It's not going to work. It can't continue, and we've got to stop it. And that's why I think if Trump's the Molotov cocktail, I'm throwing it.
And you're saying that the Molotov cocktail, explain that story, that it's the Molotov cocktail in the room that Michael Moore said, Donald Trump's a Molotov cocktail that you can throw at the system. Is that right? That's what you're saying?
And he was saying, his argument was you can't throw it. He was trying to argue for Clinton. But here's the reality. If you have a system which is implementing inhumanity and has a negative return on the investment to taxpayers, because we're basically funding all these activities. We're funding a government, which is funding a CDC, which is lying about what the data says. We're funding a Department of Agriculture, which is lying about what GMOs do to our health. We're funding a government which is either permitting or spraying toxic chemicals over our heads. So, we are funding these things, and they are using the money illegally outside of the laws, both constitutional and legislation related to financial management. At some point, we have to say, as citizens, we have a legal responsibility to enforce the laws related to constitution and financial management and assert jurisdiction over the taxes. I mean, at this point, I believe it is a criminal offense, truly, to pay your taxes. And the question is, what do we do about it? Because we've got to assert legal jurisdiction, which means we need, county, state, we need governmental support to manage it properly, because we need to make sure that money does go for lawful purposes. Those purposes need to be taken care of. So we're coming into a very critical time, and whoever is the president, it's not going to be enough. We are each going to have to deal with, and collectively with our county and our state government, we're going to have to deal with, how do we get this system back under the law?
I wanted to come back to the banks. Here we have, and I'm holding this up. You can't see it. It's a full page ad on the back page of USA Today for 10/13, and it's just so you know. I'll just read you the headline: "Moving forward to make things right." This is a full page ad on the 13th of USA Today, and it's Wells Fargo. There's their insignia up there. Wells Fargo. I like to call them now Wells Fraudgo. But it's a full-page ad on the back of the USA Today newspaper where we want to make things right. They're in big trouble. I mean, they committed massive fraud on their customer base. What do you say, what does that tell you about the system that you just talked about that needs to be changed?
Well, the large banks have committed massive fraud over the last 2 decades, and that's well documented. What I don't understand is why the American people are still banking with them. I mean, that's what's got me astonished, is that anybody would still be banking with Wells Fargo after what the disclosures were during the housing bubble and the bailouts. So I would never bank at institutions that treat their customers as though they're prey. So I just think the real solution to this is that we exercise dominion in the marketplace and say, look, we're not going to bank with institutions that behave in criminal ways or have criminality as their model. And, we have the power to change this. We don't need government. We don't need the federal government to do anything. We don't need to vote for a new president. We just pull our money. It's very, very simple.
Same thing with J.P. Morgan, that has half of the customers. And the amount I had, the person that went, that wrote the book, J.P. Madoff, you turned me on to, Chafin, is that right?
Helen Chapman. Fabulous. There's an attorney who really got to the bottom of what happened with Madoff and what J.P. Morgan Chase is up to. And, here's the reality. The depository for the U.S. government is the New York Fed. And all of the government accounts are controlled and operated by the New York Fed member banks. And all the information and payment systems are controlled by the big defense and IT contractors. So if the federal government is being run as a criminal enterprise, and it is, those entities are running it. It can't operate. And as we know, the largest defense contractor just spun off their IT group this last summer. And as you know, I believe it was because it was going to be announced the following month that the Inspector General of Department of Defense said there's $9.3 trillion missing for fiscal 2015, which is the largest amount ever since the missing money started to go missing in fiscal 1998. So, this is a very, very serious situation. And it's all being run by the large banks. So everything that's happening in this country is being engineered and operated by the large banks. They have liabilities for what is, all the money going missing. When 9.5 trillion goes missing from the federal government, then it's the top banks that are helping it go missing because they're doing the transactions and they know they're illegal. They know they're outside of the Constitution. So we're talking about criminal enterprise, whether it's J.P. Morgan doing Madoff or J.P. Morgan doing 9.5 trillion going missing from the federal government. I'm sure Wells Fargo's up to their eyeballs in it too. And so we're looking at a fundamentally criminal model, which is why when things like this happen, the most frightening thing that happened on the Wells Fargo scandal so far, Greg, is not that we keep banking at Wells Fargo despite how they behave. But in all of the congressional testimony, when the CEO was pulled up, or the now retired CEO was pulled up to explain himself, no one said, did these people have mortgages? Did these people have other loans that were securitized? How does that relate to the almost $2 trillion that the Federal Reserve has now purchased in mortgage-backed securities? Remember, if you create phony baloney mortgages and put them into the Federal Reserve as part of the quantitative easing process, that creates far more juice for the system because you don't have to share the proceeds with anybody doing a real mortgage, right?
That's right.
That's just $2 trillion pure cash injected into your capitalization or in whatever projects you want. I mean, I think as we go across, but did Congress bring that up? No, they stuck with, credit card accounts. So if you look broadly across the society.
Wait, and you're saying that, just so people understand that, you're saying that they made a lot of money in fraudulent loans and it helped them in their capital base because they're probably capital impaired. They're committing fraud to stay afloat, in effect. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know. I don't know where the money's going. What I see in the federal government, what I see in the banks, what I see across all of society is we have a significant amount of money disappearing. I call it the missing money. And in system after system, we're seeing dramatic amounts of money stolen using financial fraud, using fraud on government accounts, and that money's going someplace. And the question is, where is the money? There are two questions in America right now. Where is the money and how do we get it back? Because we can get it back, but it's going to take a very significant number of people to do it. And here's the thing. In this sense, the election is irrelevant. Because if the system continues to disappear all this money, we've now disappeared between public and private systems from 1995 on. We've disappeared, my calculation is $50 trillion. $50 trillion. That's double the on-balance sheet debt of the U.S. government, and it's many multiples of our entire retirement savings. And if we don't cope with that, guess what's going to happen when you have a balanced budget amendment? It's like, oops, sorry, folks, there's no money, and any liability to the federal government, we get to take your land and your retirement accounts to deal with.
That's why you're against any kind of messing with the Constitution. Use the Constitution the way it is now just to get the money back, period. Don't change the Constitution,
right.
Just use it to get the money back.
Right. I want to look at a balance sheet that includes that $50 trillion or the assets thereon, because that money went somewhere, and those assets belong to the U.S. taxpayer.
And finally, Deutsche Bank, could that be I don't want to call it a black swan because everybody knows they're in deep trouble. Could that be the gray swan that brings down the system? I mean, they just paid some sort of a settlement for rigging the silver market, 38 billion, which is a rounding error when you consider the Department of Justice fined them 14 billion for mishandling mortgages, as they say. They never commit fraud or crime, something to go to jail for. But anyway, could Deutsche Bank bring the system down? Is Deutsche Bank, are they still in big trouble? And could they bring the system down?
I think it's highly unlikely that Deutsche Bank could bring the system down. It's not impossible, but I think it's highly unlikely. Deutsche Bank is the German version of JP Morgan Chase, essentially. And these banks are not private companies, and you and I traditionally think of a private company. They are bureaucracies through which, state purpose, governmental purpose, leadership, society is run, so to speak. So it is a critical bureaucracy, just like AIG. I knew when Hank Paulson thought he could let AIG go down, I knew he couldn't, because AIG ran the biggest portion of the risk positions on the black budget. There's no way you can let it go down, let alone those documents become accessible in a mess. So the reality is they couldn't let AIG go down because it was, for the same reason you don't let a hospital go down when it's got millions of people, thousands of people inside the hospital being operated on at that moment. So as a matter of risk management, it is highly unlikely that the German or European society would let Deutsche Bank go down. It's a strategic, essential service bureaucracy. It's not a private company. Okay, and if you can steal $9 trillion from the federal government in 1 year, you can prop up Deutsche Bank with whatever you need. That for all we know, that $9 trillion was meant to shore up derivatives positions. So the reality is, I don't think Deutsche Bank is going to go down. What is going to take the system down, Greg, is as you have to re-engineer and overhaul institutions, you have leadership, particularly in the United States, who's lived with a debt finance growth model. So they've always been able to solve problems by throwing money at them and their pals. And their connection between each other and their political support within the globe comes from their ability to generate more money for everyone. In other words, they don't share a cultural purpose together. They don't have shared values. They don't have shared goals. They have shared looting. Okay.
You said that they were addicted in the pre-interview. You said they were addicted to privilege. Is that what you meant by that?
They are addicted to privilege, and they don't even realize it. You will see people in this group who really believe they're productive. They have no idea how their money works. So you'll see somebody say, "Oh, I'm a venture capitalist and I did great, cool things in Silicon Valley." They have no idea that technology was laundered out of Area 2051, and that black neighborhoods all over the country were destroyed with drugs to produce cheap cost of capital. They have no idea on both sides of their balance sheet how they've been subsidized. And you want to grab them and take them down to South Central LA and rub their nose in the reality of where their cheap cost of capital came from. So a lot of these folks who think of themselves as hardworking and decent have not a clue. It's part of the lack of transparency, but they are addicted to their privilege. Some of them do know. So the Clintons is a perfect example. They clearly understand because they've had to rig it. And that's the beauty. They allow all these other people to live a nice life and not have to look at the gruesomeness of what's really going on. That's one of the reasons they're probably so popular with that group. So, we have this dependency on a leadership which really has lost, understanding of reality. They've literally grown up on the step model and huge amounts of financial fraud. You need a different kind of leadership. And where this is going to break down is a crisis. You have all sorts of fantastic people in the establishment. I always get nasty comments when I say this, but there are plenty of people in the establishment who know how to run things right. They've been shoved into the corner by people like the Clintons. They know what to do. They know how to run it. They're competent. They're ethical. They're there. And frankly, the general population has never supported them because there's not a lot of support for financial responsibility. But they're there. And at some point, the responsible people who don't want to see the ship drown are going to say, stop messing with the deck chairs on the Titanic. We need to turn the boat before we hit the iceberg. or if we hit the iceberg, we need to get the lifeboats out and get in the water and start floating around and building arcs. So one way or another, where this crisis is going to come to the head is you're going to get people in the establishment who can't stand to watch another effort to kick the can, because the more you try and kick the can, the worse it's going to get.
And you think that it'll be a crisis of management that ultimately brings down the system?
Well, I'm not sure it's going to bring down the system. It's going to change the system. It's going to evolve the system. It could go in many different ways. But the reality is you're going to have continual debt crisis. The debt, you have more debt than you can handle without massive debasement. And so you're going to continue to have rolling debt and derivative crises. But you're going to have people in the establishment are saying, look, we have to have real productivity growth, not this fake growth that you keep wanting to engineer, and we have to deal with a real issue. So I think there's going to be a crisis of values between members of the establishment and members of the general population, and it is going to come down to, are we going to have a human and inhuman society? If you look at how, what the leadership that is in control now is planning, is they're planning on getting productivity by basically putting chips in all of us and using the chips in the cell tower network to mind control us. So they're talking about destroying not just political sovereignty, but individual sovereignty at a very deep level. They're talking about basically taking control of your physical body and your mind. This is worse than slavery. We're talking about livestock management here. So that's their way of dealing with the general population, because they cannot conceive of a way that they and the general population could get into alignment about really leading society in a positive direction. They can't conceive of sharing civilization with the general population. And so they're planning on an inhuman system. They're planning on treating the general population like livestock. That's why I left Washington in 1998. That's why I litigated with them for many, many years. What we were doing in the African-American neighborhoods was genocide, pure and simple. There was no difference than what the Clintons and the Bushes were doing than what Hitler did. We were rounding up innocent people and throwing them in slave labor camps where they worked for the military. That's what it was. It was covered over and papered over by a whole lot of very fancy, very expensive financial engineering. So much more expensive, I'm sure, than the Nazi system, but it was basically Nazi stuff. So we're at a break point here. We have to decide, is it human, inhuman? And frankly, the money's irrelevant. I have to tell you, I don't care how much my income is if I'm microchipped and mind controlled. I don't care. I don't care what my stock market portfolio looks like, because I'm not going to be microchipped and mind controlled. I'm not going to, I'm going to be, if you try and do that to me, then I'm going to be on this show screaming about it. So, which is why I'm on the show screaming about it. Go ahead. This is so much more serious than the presidential election or a debt crisis. We're talking about a real fundamental issue of whether we're going to be livestock or humans.
At that, we'll cut it off. I hope you come back sooner than later. Catherine Austin Fitts, the Solari Report. She is the publisher of the Solari Report on Solari.com. Catherine Austin Fitts, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
You're fabulous, Greg.
Thank you.
Bye.